History is often shaped not in decades or years, but in a single day, sometimes even in a single hour. In 1683, the fate of Europe hung by a thread as one of the greatest empires the world had ever known prepared to deliver its final, crushing blow against the West. At the gates of Vienna, two worlds collided. The might of the Ottoman Empire and the desperate defenders of a city seen as the last barrier to Christian Europe. What followed was not only a clash of armies, but a turning point that would decide the future of civilizations. This is the story of the Battle of Vienna, and of the force that arrived like thunder from the mountains to change everything. It was dawn on September 12, 1683. The city of Vienna lay in ruins after 2 months of siege. Within its shattered walls, exhausted defenders stared out with both despair and hope. Outside, the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled in Europe prepared for the final assault. 200,000 men armed to the teeth, with cannons that had reduced the city's defenses to rubble. Victory seemed within their grasp. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was certain of triumph. But something was coming that would completely alter the course of history. A force so powerful that what should have been the empire's greatest victory became one of its most catastrophic defeats. This is the story of the Battle of Vienna. But more than that, it is the story of how a single military force changed the fate of civilizations in only a few hours. To understand what happened, we must go back a few decades. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had expanded in every direction. They controlled the Middle East, North Africa, the Balkans, and had penetrated deep into Central Europe. Every sultan dreamed of conquering Vienna, the city known as the gateway to the heart of Western Europe. If Vienna fell, there would be nothing to stop the Ottomans from pushing on into Germany, France, and beyond. The Habsburg Empire, which ruled Austria and much of Central Europe, was in a desperate position. Emperor Leopold faced threats on all sides. Louis XIV of France pressed from the west. Protestants in northern Germany distrusted the Catholic emperor. And to the south and east, Ottoman power grew stronger every year. In 1681, a Hungarian revolt gave the Ottomans the perfect pretext to act. Sultan Mehmed IV decided it was time to take Vienna. He appointed his ambitious Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, to lead the campaign. Kara Mustafa was a man obsessed with glory and wealth. For him, conquering Vienna meant not only victory, but unimaginable riches. He began assembling the largest army the empire had ever fielded. 200,000 men answered his call. Among them were the Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, highly trained and fanatical soldiers who formed the backbone of the imperial army. There were the Sipahis, the heavy cavalry, mounted on magnificent Arabian horses and armed with lances, sabers, and bows. The Crimean Tatars, notorious for their ferocity, joined as well. Regiments from Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania followed, and tens of thousands of irregular raiders and adventurers flocked to the army in search of plunder. What made this army especially terrifying was its artillery. The Ottomans had pioneered gunpowder warfare in Europe, and this campaign brought with it 300 cannons, including massive bombards capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing hundreds of kilograms. These same weapons had destroyed the walls of Constantinople 2 centuries earlier. Now, they were aimed at Vienna. In the spring of 1683, the colossal army began its march. News of its approach spread terror across Central Europe. City after city surrendered without resistance, while those that defied the Ottomans were destroyed. The advancing horde seemed unstoppable. By July, they reached Vienna. The city had only about 15,000 defenders, a mixture of imperial soldiers, militias, and volunteers. Against 200,000 attackers, the odds were hopeless. Emperor Leopold fled, leaving command to Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, a seasoned and determined soldier. Starhemberg knew the only chance of survival was to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But from where could help come? Europe was divided, torn by religious and political rivalries. One man, however, refused to accept Vienna's fall. Pope Innocent XI saw the siege not only as a political struggle, but as a holy war. He launched a desperate diplomatic mission, urging Catholic princes to unite against the Ottomans. He promised money, religious dispensations, and moral authority to anyone who would march to Vienna's aid. Slowly, his message gained support. The first and most decisive answer came from King John Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski was one of the greatest commanders of his age, a man hardened by decades of warfare against the Ottomans. He understood their tactics, their psychology, and their weaknesses. For him, this was more than a campaign. It was an opportunity to save Christendom and bring everlasting glory to Poland. Sobieski began mobilizing his army, and with it came the secret weapon that would decide the battle, the Winged Hussars. These were no ordinary cavalry. They were the elite of Europe, drawn from the Polish nobility. From childhood, they were raised for war. By the age of 20, a hussar was already a master horseman and warrior. What made them unique was their equipment. They wore lighter armor than medieval knights, forged from overlapping steel plates that allowed both speed and protection. Over this, many draped leopard or tiger skins, believed to offer mystical protection. But their most iconic feature were the great wooden frames on their backs, fitted with eagle feathers. As they charged, the wings produced a terrifying whistle, designed to break enemy morale even before the lances struck. Their weapon of choice was the copia, a 6-meter lance, hollowed for lightness yet strong enough to pierce multiple enemies in a single thrust. When the lance shattered, hussars drew curved sabers sharp enough to slice through armor and bone. But their true strength lay in discipline. They did not charge in chaos like most cavalry. They attacked knee to knee, in waves, each line breaking enemy formations before the next pushed through the breach. They were, quite literally, a human storm. The Ottomans had heard rumors of the Hussars, but they had never faced them in full force, charging downhill in their thousands. They had no idea what awaited them. Meanwhile, Vienna was on the brink of collapse. Ottoman cannons fired day and night. Entire walls crumbled. Tunnels packed with gunpowder blew open new breaches. The defenders fought hand-to-hand in the ruins, but their numbers thinned. Food ran out. Disease spread. Civilians starved. Still, Starhemberg refused surrender. Each night, he climbed the broken walls, staring west in search of salvation. Each night, he saw nothing but the endless fires of the Ottoman camp. On the other side, Kara Mustafa grew impatient. Vienna had not fallen as quickly as expected. Reports of a relief army came, but he dismissed them, convinced that even if help arrived, his overwhelming numbers would crush them. This arrogance was his greatest mistake. For John Sobieski was not coming alone. Responding to the Pope's call, German princes sent troops. Charles of Lorraine brought an imperial army. John George III of Saxony sent soldiers. Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria marched with his men. Even small German states contributed. By early September, 70,000 troops had gathered in the hills north of Vienna. Though they were fewer than half the size of the Ottoman host, they were united in purpose and led by one of the greatest generals Europe had ever seen. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive battles. On September 8, 1683, the Allied Relief Army of the Holy League began its final march toward Vienna. The soldiers pushed forward through the Vienna woods, rugged and densely forested terrain that slowed their progress to a crawl. The Ottomans, who had been laying siege to the city for nearly 2 months, knew that help was coming. Yet the thick forests concealed the movement of the Christian forces, masking both their numbers and their strength. This is where Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa made his second and most crucial mistake. Instead of lifting the siege and repositioning his army in a defensible formation, he clung to his original plan. He kept the majority of his men tied down at the city walls and sent only a blocking force to intercept the approaching relief army. In the days that followed, skirmishes broke out in the hills. Ottoman advance units clashed with the Christian vanguard, attempting to delay their march, but they were repeatedly beaten back. On September 11th, the relief army finally emerged from the forests and positioned itself on the heights north of Vienna. For the first time, the two great forces could see one another face to face. What the Ottomans saw shook them. The Christian army was far larger than expected, and on the right flank, shining in the afternoon sun, stood a sight that terrified even the most battle-hardened soldiers: the armor and wings of the Polish Winged Hussars. 18,000 heavy cavalry stood assembled, the largest elite mounted force gathered in one place since the age of the Crusades. From his vantage point atop Kahlenberg Hill, King Jan Sobieski of Poland surveyed the battlefield. What lay before him was terrain perfectly suited to his secret weapon. The hill sloped gently downward toward the Ottoman lines, creating the ideal stage for a mass cavalry charge. Gravity itself would amplify the Hussars' momentum. The Ottoman army, meanwhile, was positioned on low ground, pressed up against the Danube River. If their lines broke, there would be nowhere to retreat. It was the most favorable tactical situation Sobieski could have wished for. He resolved to hold the Hussars in reserve, waiting for the moment when their strike would be most decisive. The order was given. The attack would begin at dawn. The night of September 11th was tense. Both camps understood that the following day would decide not only the fate of Vienna, but perhaps the future of Europe itself. On the Christian lines, priests walked among the soldiers, offering blessings, hearing confessions, and praying for divine protection. Across the field, Ottoman imams led their warriors in prayer, preparing them for the battle to come. Kara Mustafa, now shaken, realized he had underestimated his enemy. But it was too late to change strategy. He gave the order for his men to prepare for an assault at first light. Dawn broke on September 12th under a veil of cold fog. At first light, the Allied army began descending from the hills. German and Austrian troops advanced in the center and on the left in disciplined infantry and cavalry formations. On the right, the Poles remained in reserve, awaiting Sobieski's signal. The battle opened at 8 o'clock in the morning with a furious exchange of artillery fire. The Ottomans were at a disadvantage. Their cannons had been positioned to bombard Vienna, and many were fixed in place, unable to be turned quickly to face the new threat. Inside the besieged city, Commander Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg heard the distant thunder of cannon fire. Realizing that help had arrived, he rallied his exhausted garrison and launched a sortie against the Ottoman positions, further preventing Kara Mustafa from redirecting troops to meet the approaching relief army. Throughout the day, the fighting escalated. German and Austrian formations hammered against the Ottoman center, while the Janissaries fought back with ferocious determination, refusing to yield ground. The outcome hung in the balance. If the Ottomans could hold their lines until nightfall, there was a chance they could regroup and resume the fight the next day. Sobieski, however, remained patient. He watched from above, calculating the exact moment to unleash the force that would decide the battle. By mid-afternoon, the opportunity came. The Ottoman center was fully engaged, their reserves already committed. On their left flank, directly below the Polish position, the line was beginning to buckle under mounting pressure. Sobieski knew the time had come. He gave the signal. 18,000 winged hussars mounted their horses and formed into lines stretching more than a mile across the hillside. Regiment after regiment took their place. Sobieski himself rode along the front, inspecting his men before moving to the head of the first line. The King of Poland would personally lead the charge. With a steady hand, he raised his sword high, and the wings strapped to the hussars' backs whispered in the wind. Then, with a sweeping motion, he pointed toward the enemy below. The charge began, first at a walk, then a trot, and then, as the slope grew steeper, a full gallop. The ground trembled beneath 60,000 hoofs. The sound of the hussars' wings filled the valley with a deafening roar, like a storm descending from the mountains. Ottoman soldiers on the left flank looked up and saw an avalanche of steel, lances, and armor crashing down upon them. Many broke and fled before contact, but those who remained faced annihilation. The first wave struck like a meteor. 6-meter lances punched through armor, shields, and flesh, often impaling multiple men in a single thrust. Horses trampled infantry underfoot, while sabers flashed, cutting down anyone in reach. Before the Ottomans could recover, the second wave struck, widening the breach, followed by the third and the fourth. Within minutes, the Ottoman left flank had ceased to exist. The winged hussars wheeled inward, smashing into the center from behind. Panic swept through the Ottoman ranks. Soldiers who had fought bravely for hours now found themselves surrounded, attacked from all directions. Their formations collapsed in chaos. With the Danube at their backs, there was no escape. The battlefield dissolved into a slaughter. Kara Mustafa tried to rally his forces, but it was hopeless. His best units, the Janissaries and the Sipahis, were cut down. His cannons were captured. His camp, overflowing with the treasures plundered from Hungary, was looted. By nightfall, the great Ottoman army had been shattered. Of the 200,000 men who had besieged Vienna, at least 15,000 lay dead on the field, and tens of thousands more were slain in the chaotic pursuit that followed. The relief army suffered fewer than 2,000 losses. Vienna was saved. Europe was saved, and it was achieved by the largest and most devastating cavalry charge in history. For the Ottoman Empire, this disaster marked the beginning of decline. Kara Mustafa fled to Constantinople, where he was executed on the Sultan's orders for his failure. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was destroyed. In the years that followed, the Habsburgs and their allies pushed the Ottomans out of Hungary and deeper into the Balkans. Never again would the empire seriously threaten Central Europe. For Poland, the victory brought glory but little lasting reward. Sobieski was hailed across Christendom as a savior, with Pope Innocent XI calling him the defender of civilization. Yet the campaign drained Poland's resources, and in the decades that followed, the kingdom's internal divisions left it vulnerable to partition. Poland itself would vanish from the map for over a century. For the Winged Hussars, Vienna was both their greatest triumph and their swan song. The charge of September 12, 1683, was the largest and most successful heavy cavalry assault ever recorded, but it was also among the last. Gunpowder weapons and modern infantry tactics were reshaping the battlefield. Within a few decades, heavy cavalry would no longer decide wars. Yet the legend of the Hussars endured. For centuries, stories of the charge were told and retold. Painters captured the avalanche of riders crashing down from Kahlenberg. Poets and musicians celebrated their courage. The Hussars became a symbol of determination, unity, and victory against impossible odds. The Battle of Vienna was more than a military triumph. It was proof of what could be achieved when divided peoples came together against a common enemy. Catholics and Protestants, who had slaughtered each other for generations, now stood side by side. German princes set aside rivalries. Poles, Austrians, Italians, and Bavarians fought as one. Together, they accomplished what none could have achieved alone. It was also a lesson in leadership. Sobieski, a king, placed himself in the front rank, sharing the danger of his soldiers. He did not ask them to risk what he himself would not. His example inspired loyalty and courage, qualities that no command or rhetoric could replace. And it was a lesson in the power of tactics and timing. The Hussars were not just ordinary cavalry. They were the product of centuries of training, evolution, and refinement, a weapon designed for a specific moment. And at Vienna, Sobieski used them with devastating precision. The consequences of that day still echo. Vienna survived. Europe's balance of power was preserved. And from a hillside in 1683, history changed direction, not because of abstract forces, but because of the choices, courage, and resolve of men who refused to surrender. Tactically, the Winged Hussars represented the final evolution of shock cavalry. For centuries, cavalry had faced the same dilemma: what to do after the initial charge. Traditional mounted troops could crash into enemy lines with tremendous force, but once entangled in close combat, they lost their momentum, became vulnerable, and often suffered heavy losses. The Hussars solved this problem. Armed with long lances and employing a multi-wave technique, they struck with devastating impact, rode through enemy lines, reformed quickly, and then charged again. Each wave shattered a fresh part of the opposing force, allowing them to maintain mobility and relentless pressure. Technologically, they were the perfect balance of speed, protection, and striking power. Their armor, influenced by Oriental designs, was light enough for long charges yet strong enough to deflect most blows. Their hollow wooden lances were extremely long, giving them reach over their opponents while remaining manageable with one hand. Their horses were carefully bred and trained for endurance, able to carry a fully armed rider at full speed across long distances. Beyond equipment, the Hussars' greatest strength was professionalism. They were not part-time soldiers, but lifelong warriors, trained since childhood and drilled constantly. They moved as one, understanding each other's commands and maneuvers instinctively. This cohesion transformed them from individual horsemen into a single, decisive weapon of war. By contrast, much of the Ottoman army at Vienna lacked such discipline. While the Janissaries were elite and well-trained, the majority of troops were provincial levies, irregular fighters, or adventurers. They were brave, but they lacked the cohesion and command structure of the Hussars. When confronted by the precision of the Polish cavalry, their formations could not withstand the assault. The terrain of Vienna played a decisive role in Sobieski's strategy. He chose Columberg Hill with masterful care. The slope was long and gradual, perfect for building maximum speed. Had it been too steep, horses would have stumbled. Too flat, and the charge would not have gathered enough momentum. Rough terrain would have broken the formation. Instead, this hill provided ideal conditions, as though it had been designed for cavalry. Some historians suggest Sobieski was merely fortunate, but this underestimates his preparation. He scouted for days, studied maps, and consulted local guides. He knew exactly what ground he needed, and he positioned his army to exploit it. This was no accident. It was brilliant military calculation. Timing was equally critical. Sobieski kept his cavalry in reserve for hours while the battle raged. Many commanders would have grown impatient, but he waited for the precise moment. He allowed the Ottomans to commit their reserves and weaken their flanks. He chose the moment when the sun was setting, blinding defenders as they looked uphill. Only when every factor aligned did he release his secret weapon. The result was catastrophic for the Ottomans. Eyewitnesses described the charge with awe. An Austrian officer wrote that it seemed as though the entire mountain was descending upon the Ottoman lines, the thunder of hooves mixed with the eerie whistling of the Hussars' wings. A German soldier said they moved so quickly it was as if they flew. Ottoman chroniclers, overwhelmed by the spectacle, described them as mounted demons or accused them of witchcraft, claiming the Poles had used sorcery to give their horses unnatural speed and strength. These accounts, however exaggerated, reveal the psychological terror that such a charge inflicted. For infantry armed with muskets that could fire perhaps once a minute, there was no defense against thousands of armored horsemen rushing at nearly 50 kilometers an hour. The ground shook, the air filled with dust, and within seconds the cavalry was upon them. Instinct demanded retreat. The Hussars had mastered the art of triggering this primal fear, and used it to break armies long before the fighting even began. Yet, they were not invincible. Marshes, forests, or rocky ground could rob them of their advantage. Disciplined infantry behind fortifications could withstand them. Losses could be heavy in the wrong conditions, and maintaining them was expensive. Even Poland could field only a limited number. But at Vienna, every condition was perfect: terrain, timing, leadership, and an enemy caught unprepared. That afternoon, 18,000 Hussars changed the course of European history. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The Ottoman army was destroyed, and with it, the empire's aura of invincibility. For centuries, Europeans had feared Ottoman expansion, but now their prestige was shattered. States that had long paid tribute found the courage to resist. Within the empire, political unrest grew, reforms were demanded, and the Janissaries, once untouchable, began to lose influence. For the Habsburgs, Victory marked the beginning of a golden age. With the Ottoman threat removed, they consolidated their control of Central Europe, retook Hungary, pushed into the Balkans, and turned Vienna into the heart of an empire. Its magnificent Baroque architecture, still admired today, was largely built in the century following the battle, financed by these new conquests. For Poland, however, the outcome was less fortunate. While King John Sobieski became immortalized as a hero, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth itself gained little lasting benefit. Hampered by its unique political system in which any noble could veto legislation, the state remained paralyzed and unable to reform. As its neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, modernized and centralized, Poland weakened. Within a century, those same allies who had fought beside it at Vienna divided the Commonwealth and erased it from the map. The very force that had saved Europe could not save its own homeland. The Battle of Vienna also marked a turning point in military history. It was one of the last great victories for heavy cavalry. The age of knights and shock charges was ending, soon replaced by massed infantry armed with muskets and supported by increasingly deadly artillery. Cavalry would still play roles in reconnaissance and pursuit, but never again would it decide a battle on such a scale. The Charge of Vienna was the last thunderclap of a tradition stretching back to antiquity. But what a thunderclap it was! In a single afternoon, the fate of civilizations was altered. Vienna was saved, Europe preserved, and Ottoman expansion halted. Sobieski's hussars rode down the hill, not only into victory, but into legend. Their wings whispered across history, echoing through the centuries as a reminder of courage, timing, and leadership. For the men who fought, it was also a battle of faith. Sobieski and his troops prayed before the charge, and after the victory, he sent word to the Pope. We came, we saw, and God conquered. Across Europe, churches rang in thanksgiving, and the date became a feast day in many Catholic lands. Their conviction that they fought under divine protection gave them extraordinary courage and resolve, allowing them to endure when others might have faltered. The Battle of Vienna remains one of the most spectacular feats of arms ever recorded. It was a moment when everything was at stake, when leadership, faith, and preparation aligned perfectly. It was proof that in history, decisive moments often come not from inevitability, but from the choices of individuals willing to act boldly. On September 12, 1683, the Winged Hussars charged down Kahlenberg Hill and saved not only a city, but a civilization.